Okay, so we're going to start today a little bit different. So we're in an interview, and and I'll just say I'm the interviewer. I ask you a question. So suppose I'm building an application, but I don't really want to take the time to build any views. Why would I want to do that? And what do you know about applications that do that? Anyone? Go ahead, Jake.
You're just trying to transfer data to another application that's either gonna use that data behind the scenes or use it to load views on a different app
Okay, cool. What's a word that comes to mind?
API.
Yeah, there we go. That's the keyword I want y'all to be like. If you ever hear this, like, oh, we're not going to build views, I want you to be thinking APIs. And so, to follow up on that question, when I'm structuring the data that I'm exposing in an API, what considerations might I need to make?
I guess I'll just keep going. The format that's expected from you and the specific data that you want to expose to the API.
Absolutely. And what's a common way that you can customize the format of your JSON? Go ahead, Jenny.
Serializers?
Yeah, serializers. What's a serializer? We're sticking with you, Jenny.
What is it? uh, I don't know. It's a way to format how your data is returned, I think.
Yeah, that works. It's a way to customize um, your JSON, and it's basically encapsulating the idea of just doing that, right? So we're using the serializer to expose, like we have, objects, right? Like whether it's a poro, maybe we're using OpenStruct, maybe we have active record objects, whatever it is, we have them, they have a ton of data, but we might not want to expose all that data. We might want to customize the way that that data is structured in a way that other developers can expect. And serializers are kind of like the way that we encapsulate just that task, right? We have an object structured a certain way, and then our task as a serializer is to format this object or maybe these objects in a way that can be expected, maybe is conventional, and only exposes the data that we decide to expose. Okay, so Um, I think that covers it. But that task is the serializer's task. So that's why serializer in Rails will create a new class for it, and we'll customize it for these specific objects that we want to expose, right? We might have multiple endpoints for one object, right? If we have, if we can imagine a if we can imagine that a there's an orders table, right? And this orders table has a couple of endpoints, a couple of business intelligent endpoints, but the way that we want to format um, orders when we expose them, whether we're showing one, all, a collection based on an active record query, maybe we want to format those all the same, and we can take care of that task with a serializer. Okay. What do y'all know about serializers thus far that hasn't been said? And are there any questions about serializers that are front of mind, top of mind? Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I guess just kind of like a structure question, but if we're passing in like a collection of objects and we want to make the output different based on like an active record query, is it best to make like a method in the serializer or like have a separate serializer for that output?
You would want to make a method in the serializer to show a custom, like a custom something, like whether it's a count, an average, a sum that maybe you just want on the serializer. But the problem is you have to decide, does the rest of my application need access to this query? Or is this something that I can just show on this specific serializer, and I know that I don't need to show it anywhere else? And that's kind of like where you make your decision of, does this belong in the serializer? Does this belong in the model? And then I can call it from the serializer. That's going to be a decision that you'll have to make based on where you're calling certain methods. Like I would think, if we think of the idea of having a query on the model level, right? And that query gets us a subset of whatever the model is based on some where conditions, based on maybe a joins clause, maybe we're grouping by a certain thing. So that specific query, if it returns a subset of, say, orders, then we would want that query on the model level, and then we can simply pass as long as we have a collection of orders, it doesn't really matter how we got to that collection, whether we called order.all or order.sum query, we're still going to use the same orders or order serializer in that case. Now, this will be different if your endpoint is not returning a collection of orders, right? Maybe we start on orders, but what we're actually returning is, a collection of some other object, or possibly like a collection of data that's like, hey, now this looks different. And it's like, here's my order ID. And that points at, some calculation that I've done, right? That's going to be a different object that maybe your orders serializer can't handle. Boom, we spin up a new serializer on the dot, and we use that to serialize this custom, query that we have. And this is going to be very much up to you as the API developer. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I was mostly wondering when it's like pointing to like a revenue or something like that, but we're still like querying a bunch of orders or something. So yeah, that helps a lot.
Cool. Other questions coming up? Yeah, go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there's a way to, and it sounds like there's not, but just to kind of clarify, if I have an array of items, and sometimes I want all the item data, and sometimes I only want to give like the name and ID, would that have to be two separate serializers, or can I put in some sort of like conditionals?
I think you can do a conditional, but like I would avoid conditionals in that case, and I would do like whatever, maybe like the name of my query or something, like as maybe a namespace, and then order or item serializer, and then I'd maybe have my standard item serializer, right? So it's like, okay, like this time I want to show it this way based on some query, and then here's my standard item serializer that I want to show most of the time. Like it's okay. I want you to feel okay with like spinning up a custom serializer. It's you'll see from the code, it's like a simple class. And if you need it to be different than what your current item serializer is, I would rather see you spin up a brand new object to serialize that data and follow more SRP rather than putting some kind of conditional logic in the item serializer that now makes that serializer more complex. And I don't, to be completely honest, I don't even know if you can put conditional logic in there, but I would imagine yes, since it's just a Ruby class that behaves kind of specifically, but like at the end of the day, it's Ruby. Good question though. Okay, so I think I'll just share. I don't think we're gonna do this warm up where you go. Actually, no. I'm gonna give you all a chance to. This could be the first time you've heard of a serializer. This could be the, I don't know where everyone's at. So let's take 5. Just go research serializers on your own. 5 minutes. Look at whatever you find. If it's useful, then I'm gonna like ask for people to share out. But 5 minutes on your own. Research serializers. We'll come back together at 17. Okay, so yeah, go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah, this question isn't necessarily serializer specific, but I keep coming across like different generators, and I know at one point we were told not to really use them, but I keep seeing them like in a way where I think that it could be beneficial to learn from how they're setting things up. And I just wanted to ask your opinion on that, and if that's still something we should avoid.
They are useful to use generators. I think up till now we wanted you to get some practice structuring JSON on your own manually, and now within this class we'll kind of show you the JSON API 1.0 like standardization, the reasons for convention around this, and the fast JSON gem that helps build to this customization. It's not the only one. There are many JSON builders out there that do it a couple of different ways. This one is based on this like new standard that's, I wouldn't call it widely used. I would call it like beginning to be implemented as a standard. And if we think about standards like something like REST, right? Like part of the reason we use it is so that we just don't have to think about it and other developers don't have to think about it, right? If we use convention, then we're freeing up cognitive energy, which, as you know, building out a project like could be used elsewhere, could be used somewhere else creatively. And if we just standardize something like this is how all JSON will be formatted, like across the board, like you could be, exposing anything, but here's how we're going to format that. That is now less of a lift as whether you're consuming that API as a dev, whether you're coming into a new code base as a dev and, looking at the API that you're going to be working on internally. And now everyone just expects the same way. It's like, okay, great, we've agreed upon something, and now moving on with our lives. Let's worry about other problems. Does that help answer it? Cool. All right. Anything that you all found in your search that hasn't been talked about here, or that maybe brought up some other questions, or that you thought was cool? You guys just played with your dogs for like 5 minutes, huh?
I am seeing that we can add objects in there. Like we can actually like define an object and render that to the screen, which seems interesting. I didn't get to read a ton about it, but I'll show you what I'm.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So something along this line.
Cool. Yeah, so this is interesting. This is basically it's like the idea here is that like this is still a class, right? And you can still put some Ruby code in here to customize how the serializer looks and what you need to what this serializer can do. And you have to think like when owner is called, which it will be kind of like under the hood here as an attribute, then this method runs that we've defined here. And all we've done here is like as an attribute, we've defined something custom right there on our serializer, just like we would on any other class, right? So that's available. This is something you can do.
Would you call that objectifying an attribute? Sorry.
I don't think so. Like, I don't know if that's like some, I don't know if you were making a joke or if that's like some actual term, but I haven't heard it. Okay. Anything else that came up that you want to talk about, show off, any of that? This is very much like high level, like we're intending to kind of like scratch the surface of our curiosity on serializers. Yeah, go ahead, Kwa.
Ultimately, how far of a customization do you really want to do in a serializer? Now, where is the point where you should stop?
Depends on how complex your data is, right? Like, and that's a great question that I will say requires quite a bit of nuance. So, I mean, ideally, if it's one object or a collection of objects, we follow this like JSON 1.0 API standardization, and we don't have to think about it, right? Like it's like we're going to customize it to this spec and move on with our lives. But obviously, a lot of times, or not a lot of times, sometimes you're going to get to some situations where the data is more complex. And yeah, you can certainly still standardize it across the board, but you might have to do some things under the hood in order to get to the simplest representation of the data within that 1.0 standardization. So yeah, it's going to require a lot of nuance is what I'll say. But for the sake of what we're doing on this project, what we're learning today, we're learning the standardization, and that's going to be the foundation for serializers. You're really not going to have to like, I mean, unless you have an object or a collection of objects that also needs to show, 5 or 6 like nested relationships that are attached to it. If that's not the case, then we can keep it pretty simple.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay. So I want y'all to look at this JSON API standardization. There are some questions, kind of like leading questions in the lesson plan. And I'm going to link you to the correct link in the chat. And yeah, I'll just share real quick. Great. So within the lesson plan, it's here. And then these are the questions I want you to think about. Let's do this. Let's take 10 minutes and work in a break. I want you to like push yourself to either write down the answers to these questions or come up with like a couple of things on your own that you're like noticing about the structure. All right. And so if I click on this, I want you to like take a look at this structure and tell me, this is a pretty advanced one, I'll say, but it follows a pattern. All right. So I want you to like, the questions are intended to help you recognize that pattern. Okay. Let's take 10, come back at 35. Thanks, 35.
Thank you, 35.
Sharing. Thank you, Hope. Okay, it's 35. So let's come back together and see what y'all found interesting. So this large JSON structure you looked at, and then maybe the specification for this JSON API 1.0 has quite a bit of information. What about this first question here? What's the root level key? Yeah, go ahead, Jesus.
Is it the data?
Yeah, that's a good catch too, because you also have that links key in there. So why didn't you say links?
Because the links, it's its own like hash. That's at the very beginning, and it only contains those 3-4 lines of code right there. And then in the bottom, it's got the data, another key, and then that has an array of a bunch of stuff. So I just went based off the data, and because the earlier lookup of the serializer, most of the stuff had like data and then the stuff that comes with it. And so when you did talk about the beginning that this is a more high level thing, I figured the links were like, that's kind of like where you were talking about.
Yeah, okay. So a couple of things to unpack there, and I'm gonna share my screen just to make it easier to follow along with what I'm looking at. Okay, so get y'all over here. And yeah, let's go back here. Okay, so yeah, this, like you said, data is pointing at an array here, and this links kind of just points to, some links that at the top level end with this hash, whereas the data points to an array that has quite a few objects in it. And that initial object we can see is like of type article, it's ID 1, it has a specific attribute called a title, and then it also has relationships, which points to another hash, and kind of so on and so forth. So the data is the top level key. And if I look at the specification here, this is an important page to understand the rules around the specification. So I'm not going to worry too much about the headers here, but know that that's kind of like formatted for you in most cases. So you don't necessarily have to worry about that in a lot of cases. But I do want to look at this top level here. So a document must contain at least one of the following top level members. And so generally this will be data or errors, right? And so this is generally going to be like, hey, here's the data that we got back from this API, or here's the errors, here's what happened, here's why things went wrong. So a document may contain any of these top level members. And so it has links, it has included, it has this JSON API, which would point to this like specification, this documentation, kind of like describing why the server JSON response is formatted the way that it is. But I want you to like really think about these bolds here when you're looking at the specification. Like, hey, this is what it must have. Here's a good one, must not, right? If you have data, you don't have errors. If you have errors, you don't have data. All right, so that's a clear cut thing. And yeah, this, if we kind of scroll down a little bit more, you can see a couple of implementations of data, whether you have a single resource or you have a collection of resources. All right, so it could be that you have this data, you have the type and ID at the top, it's got attributes, it's got relationships. That's one implementation. Notice how it's not pointing at an array here. It's pointing at a hash, and that's okay because this is for one single object. You could also not have these two optional members, which are attributes and relationships. The only members that must be there in data is type and ID. All right, whether it's a hash or an array, the next level of hash like needs to have type and ID. Those have to be there. Okay, and then I don't know if there is one for, trying to find one. Well, the one that we looked at on the previous page is a good example of like, here's what it could look like as an array. You can see at this nested hash here, the top level members are still type and ID. Attributes you can have, relationships you can have, but they're not required. Okay, questions coming up now that we've kind of dug in just a little bit. Go ahead, Kwa.
What about the case where when they ask for an error that comes back as an object, but on the same time, I guess other conditions, they're also asking for another comes back as an error. If you can't find any record of it, they want us to actually give them like an empty object.
Yeah, so it's okay for the data to point at an empty array, right? It's okay for that to be like, hey, there's actually like, there wasn't an error, but there's also like no data for this specific request. Like that's,
So at that
okay.
point, if we return an error or something like that, then it would break the system down, right? We should just kind of give them like an empty object at that point.
Well, yeah, I want you to like I want to differentiate between like the idea that there's no data and there's an error, because those are two different things. Like an error could happen based on quite a few things. You're unauthenticated, you passed the wrong headers, and like you told me I should return an HTML page, but I expect to return JSON. You passed in poor params that, you know, the server wasn't able to handle. There's a number of reasons why you could get an error, but if like you pass in the correct request with all of the correct requirements and there's just no data, right? Like that, if I call, you know, user.all, but I don't have any users in my database, like that's okay. We didn't get an error, but you get an empty collection.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Genevieve.
So at what point, like, are there limitations of JSON? Does it have characters that are not accepted? And if so, do we have to cleanse data before we send stuff out?
That's a good question. I would expect that my JSON is, when it comes down to the key value pairs, is pointing at like very basic objects. Like it's another hash, it's a string, or it's an array, right? Like that's generally what my keys are going to point to as values, like nested hash, array, string, value. So that's why I would say like, when it comes to special characters, like hopefully those are just housed in a string, right? And then it can handle any special character. That's kind of how I think of it in regards to this question, but tell me if I'm on the wrong track and you mean something else.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, for example, if you were sending out an object and let's say a name, right? Like names are one of those things that kind of sometimes contain hyphens, could contain other things. Are there any limitations where it's like there's a character that you can't send out?
Generally, no, because we would house that entire name within a string. Even if it had a hyphen in it, we'd be like, hey, name points at a string, and that string can have, you know, all the characters that exist because it's a string.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I kind of wanted, anything else coming up before we move on? Okay, cool. Let me pull up the lesson plan. Yeah, okay. Great. Yeah, let's move on to this Congress tracker exercise. So I'm gonna like just frame this a little bit. I'm gonna code. I'm gonna write some code. I'm gonna, hit some endpoints, and then I'm gonna turn it over to y'all for like most of the rest of the lesson, and have y'all try to build something out. You've got some options. Based on whether, like, if you have problems with this Congress tracker repo for any reason, like based on where we're starting or what we're doing, then you can kind of cruise on down to exercise 2, standalone repo. It's like, hey, here's a nice repo that will actually like do all the things that you need it to do and won't throw you any errors in theory. But you have to do some setup. So there's like, hey, you have to create a couple models, you have to create a join table, this many to many relationship, and then we have a seeds file. So just so you know, that's available too if you get to a point where you're like, I think I'm getting like an error that just I am getting, and I don't want to deal with that right now. I want to focus on trying to practice my serializer building. You've got another option here. Okay, see you. Let's go back to the top. So yeah, I'm starting on the refactor branch. And if I'm on this branch and I look at my ProPublica controller, let's not worry about these for now. So right now, it should look like this. Fact check me. Does it look like this for y'all? Okay, cool. So I have this member. This is based on like the refactoring pattern y'all did. That simply calls into my facade, and which calls my service. Great. My controller doesn't need to know about any of that. It's just like, hey, give me something back. So if I start my server up here, cool, already started, and I open up localhost. That's not what it's going to give me. That's what it's going to give you eventually, but not right now. Let's look at Senator Warren. If I do a search here, uneventful, right? My search key gets grayed out. If I look at my server though, great place to look. Completed 204, no content. Okay, great. The request was fine, but we didn't tell our controller action what to do at this point. So what I need to do is probably something like this, right? Render JSON, and then tell it what to render, which is whatever member of Congress I get. All right. So if I add this to, I think that's how it works. If I add that to my server, I reload this home page, and now I search for Senator Warren. Great. I get something better. Let's just do that. So now I get actual JSON, and it's got all of Senator Warren's attributes. And where did these attributes come from? Well, that's pretty abstracted away from you at this point, but just to remind you, we have a member PORO at this point that has all of these attributes here for you. These indeed line up with what is displayed here in the page. All right, everybody okay with this so far? Any issues or concerns? Cool. Okay, so let's go back to the lesson plan. So this is fine, but it's not standardized, right? We just learned about this JSON API specification. We don't have that here. So we need to do that by creating a custom serializer. So we're not just passing our PORO to the render JSON method, but instead we're actually like showing it to the world the way that we've decided to specify based on this JSON API 1.0. Okay, cool. So here's some things to do. Add gem fast JSON API to your gem file. And I'm going to go through this with y'all. I just added it right here because this is something that we'll want to use in production, right? Like we'll want production to know about this gem so that it serves up our data correctly. So I put it here, and then I need to bundle. I already did this, so I'm not going to do that. But one thing that I need to do now is generate a serializer. All right. So what I can do, stop this server. I'll say Rails G. Remember, G stands for generator. That's how I can generate really anything: controllers, models, serializers. If I say serializer member, this is going to be the name of my serializer here. That's the first argument. And then I pass it all the attributes that I'd like it to have as the rest of the arguments in lowercase, right? And these basically correspond to what the PO looks like at this point, which if we go back to it, ID, title, first name, middle name, last name, I decided, hey, we're not gonna put the middle name in there, but this is custom JSON, right? Customizing it. If you want to put it in there, be empowered. You can put it in there, get that data. And remember, data is probably much larger than just these hashes. This is just what we're taking out of it. So remember that what's coming back as a response from the API is much bigger. We're just basically kind of like slowly but surely simplifying it into a PO row. Now in a serializer, simplifying it down into a serializer that's specific to how we want to expose this data. Okay, so go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, I was wondering when in the serializer the ID is implicit versus it just being there, because I know in our like the example responses, the ID is there, and when we serialize it, it's there, but we don't actually implicitly or explicitly name it as an attribute in a serializer. How does that work?
Yeah, it's implicitly there under the hood, and that's kind of like something I was gonna show as part of this like example, but you can like set it to be, if you can override it in the serializer. I'm trying to think of an example of when you'd want to do that, and I can't think of one, to be honest, but like it's available for you if you want to call it. I think that's like you set it as not an attribute, but as a high level like ID, and then you can point it to like whatever you want. But implicitly, if you don't call it anywhere, so if you don't have ID called anywhere, basically that means it expects your object to have the ID. So whatever I'm passing the serializer, whether it's an object or a collection of objects, Fast JSON API expects that to be there, and will be unhappy if it's not there. And we'll get into like an example. All right. So I know I did this already. Boop, boop, yeah, so this is what it should look like if you're following the lesson plan. You run this, great. We'll pretend that I ran it, and then I come over here to this member serializer, and great, look at that. I get this is included by default. It's kind of like including my gem by default, and y'all should probably see this as well. Okay, great, that's nice. But now if I go back and start my server, I'm kind of like, all right, great, I got a serializer. Let's see what that looks like in the JSON. So let's go back to my search page. What other senators are y'all thinking about that I should put in here? Yell one out.
John McCain.
McCain. I don't think this is gonna work, but we'll see. Yeah, okay, so it got no data. Our API is not very flexible at this point. It doesn't know how to handle that use case. So we got to put in a senator that is currently serving in Congress. It's a limitation of our current implementation. Okay, we'll go with everyone's favorite, Ted Cruz. Okay, this looks like the same that it was. Why is this? I just made a serializer, but I'm not seeing any serialized data here. Any ideas? Yeah, Angel, go ahead.
You didn't implement the serializer in your controller?
Sure didn't. If I go here, that's nice that I have a serializer, but this class just like exists. I need to instantiate it if I want to use it. So I go back to my ProPublica controller, and now I look at this. What I need to do here is I need to call member serializer. I need to instantiate it with a .new, and I need to pass it the object that I expect to be serialized. All right. And now, if I go back to my search and I hit Mr. Cruz again, thanks Rails for updating my code, not making me restart my server. There's a lot of work that went into that feature, so thank you, Rails. Now I get something else, right? I get the data. It's pointing at just a hash, right? So that tells me that there's only one of these objects. Got my ID and my type. These are implicitly assigned at this point based on the name of the object that I passed in. And actually, I'm not sure if it's based on the name of the object or based on the name of the serializer, now that I think about it. I'm gonna guess actually that it's based on the name of the serializer, because that would make more sense, but maybe I want to test that theory moving forward, or maybe one of you do. We'll see. And then this ID is also implicit. We have the ID showing up also in the attributes, but you can see, I'll show you a quick way to change that. If I get rid of this here, I don't necessarily want to duplicate data. I don't want to repeat myself. I mean, there might be reasons for this. Reasons down the road, or based on your shitty tech debt API that the company that you work for has had for 10 years. There could be some reasons, but for the sake of now, we're not going to duplicate the ID. So if I remove it here and I don't know if I can refresh that. I think I still have to send another form param here. And I search now, just title, first name, last name's here. ID still showing up. Type still showing up. These are implicit, right? Like I didn't define these anywhere in my serializer, right? There's no ID, there's no type. This is implicit, and this is done under the hood by the fast JSON API object serializer. So thanks, fast JSON API. What else? Anything coming up for y'all as we go through this? Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
So when we're using these serializers and we need external sources of things in order to, maybe this is better, like, would it be better to have a serializer that has like a conditional when something happens, or like just to make another serializer that is like, is it better to like encapsulate serializers or make them more generalized for certain types of objects?
I would start with like the most basic type of serializer I need, like this member serializer, like very basic, right? Just has attributes, ID, and type. And then from there, if there are some complex like use cases happening based on the way that the data comes back, or based on what I want to show for specific endpoints, my strategy, and this is where it gets a little opinionated, is based in single responsibility principle. If I'm adding a bunch of conditionals, like that makes my code more likely to break or be brittle or be harder to maintain. So my strategy would be spin up a serializer. If it's, a member serializer and it's something, it needs to be like different, like This is my base serializer, and then maybe I have another member serializer that is like, maybe I had like a house member serializer, and that differs from a Senate member serializer, right? And those have different things coming back. Like, I would spin up new serializers based on that. And I don't know if this syntax will actually work like this, like where it's namespace. Like, that's just what I go to because that's usually how it is, but it might look like this, right? And I might have like, okay, I have the Senate member serializer, or maybe I have the House, and then maybe like there's an opportunity for inheritance somewhere, and this like eventually inherits from my base member serializer class at some point. I don't know. That could happen. It may not be the right use case. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, go ahead, Jacob.
Sorry if I missed this, but when we're like building out a relationship in the JSON, is it only going to bring back the top level information for stuff for the relationship, or can you include more attributes within that relationship?
You can include more. You can customize it to be even more granular within that relationship if you need to. Yeah. Okay, cool. Other questions? Jesus, go ahead.
So right now at member is just the one object, but if you have like a members and several objects and you pass them through that serializer you just built, is that going to create the data several, like go through each member and create the ID type and attributes for each one, or is it just going to do it for one? Do you have to make a separate one for multiple, or would it work for many?
It works for a single and it works for a collection of the same objects, and I could like demonstrate that real quick. All right, so I'll have a member here, but let's actually just 5. Let's do 3. 3 dot times do. Oh yeah. I don't want this to be in there. This is going to be at members. How do I want to do this? I'm going to cheat a little bit. Let's go to my facade. Yeah. Let's put a pry here. All right. Cool. Let's look at what members 0 looks like. I wish it was less than this, but I only need. I think that's all I need. I think that's all the attributes. Okay, so let's copy that. And let's make data look like that. Okay, I think this should work now. Just make sure. Yeah, so I'll basically have duplicates. Yeah, and that's fine. Let's look and see what this creates for us. Oh yeah, I need to get out of this pry. Yeah, I know, you're mad. Okay, let's try this. Let me just look at my controller one more time. Yeah, I think this should work. Oh, nope, see, member serializer.new. Now I'm going to pass it this collection of members, which is basically just going to be like 3 po rows that I created right here on the fly. I'm literally like not doing anything now with that member. So that's like going out to this API, making a call and coming back and not even using it. But I just wanted to show, just for Jesus's question, what this could look like. Oh no, the pry. What? That's not what I expected. Maybe it's removing duplicates under the hood. That's interesting. That's kind of what I think's going on here. I think it's like, hey, you've got this data, but it's all the same, so we're going to serialize and remove that duplicate under the hood. That's kind of cool. Didn't know it did that. This is why you try stuff out. All right, so maybe we won't use this block, and we'll just do this. I need a new member. Great, so we'll call this member 1, and then let's reset this data. I wonder if that's based on the, I would think that that's based on the ID, to be honest. So we maybe will play around with this. Let's redefine data here. Let's change the ID just slightly. And then let's say that member 2 is going to be this. And then let's just put these two in an array. Member 1, member 2. Okay, cool. Do y'all hate what I'm doing? Do you follow what I'm doing? Have I totally lost you? Any questions? I'm basically just trying to like show you that you can pass a collection to the serializer and it'll still work. But that doesn't work with this duplicate ID, is my theory. So let's see. One more time. Doesn't even matter who we search here because we're basically just using hard-coded data, but I also want to get that pry out. Cool. It was based on the ID, I think, because it's fine with everything else being duplicated, but that's kind of cool, actually. It's removing duplicates by default for you under the hood. Fast JSON API is based on if the ID is duplicated. But yeah, you can pass it, and now you notice that data points at an array. Okay, I want to give y'all a chance to run through this. So let's see where the lesson plan says to go from here. We did all that. Okay, cool. Yeah, so serializing active record objects. Fun. So we were just serializing a PORO, right? That thing didn't have a model. It wasn't connected to our database. I wanted to show you that active record objects give you a little bit more customization features, things that you can do. So I would start here, and then you're going to have to like do some things, add some code, like create some dummy users, and then basically you're going to create the route action and the code within the controller to expose the data of all your users. This is fun. We're living on the edge. Look at what we get to do in class that you'll never get to do in the real world unless you want to, you know, be sued. But yeah, so that's the exercise for building off of like what we have so far from here. There's this other exercise, the standalone repo. You could also do that one. If you look at this and you're like, I kind of want to just like do it with this. I don't even want to expose my users' data as a joke because that just feels so wrong to me. Then you can do this one. And yeah, I think that's what we're going to do for like the next like around hour-ish. But what we'll do is take a break because we've been going for a little while. We'll do it a little differently. I'm going to have y'all work on your own because I want everyone to practice this. I'm going to leave this room open, but what I'd like for you all to do is like work on your own, come back. We'll come back together at like, let's say 39. And then we'll see like, hey, what'd you come up with? Like, let's see your implementation. We'll see a few implementations. Then we'll let you continue working. Doesn't matter where you are at that point. Let you continue working to the end. But I imagine that you'll have questions along the way. That's why I'm saying I'll leave this room open the whole time you're working. Pop back in this room when you're ready and you have a question. If you don't pop back in the room till 39, that's okay too. Right? You've got options here. Okay, so that's it. Anyone not understand what I'm asking you to do? Cool. You don't have to leave, but you do have to know that students are going to ask questions in here. So if you don't want to get distracted by that, then do leave and just come back at 39, or do leave and come back when you have a question, whatever you prefer. All right, I'm pausing the recording until someone has something that they need to say. And I'm going to stop sharing. What's up, Andrew?
Yeah, I have a question. I was like looking through this this other repo earlier on books and stores, and I was wondering, when we add like the has many books to the serializer that allows it to kind of like display all that relationship data, is there a way we can add like what information we want to be displaying within each book specifically, because it just comes up with an ID and a type? Are we able to add, like, if we wanted to like add the book title and like the author or whatever else in there, where exactly that would live, since just the has many books is kind of doing all that for us?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm like pretty positive that you can, but what I'm thinking is that the fast JSON API maybe expects you to, this is what I'm thinking. I think it expects you to like, you can show that, hey, this, store has many books and here they are, the ones that it has, but then what it's expecting is that you have an API defined that can then, based on that collection of IDs or whatever, go and you can go like get those books and all of that serialized book data from a different endpoint. And maybe it's like, the idea with not showing that is keeping it simple enough to where you just show, hey, this is a book, here's the ID. Now you can go, and if you need all of that attribute information, you can go and get that from a different endpoint. That is my thought. And I'm not sure if you can. I think I said that you can, to a question that came up earlier with someone. I think maybe Jesus asked it, but you can customize this to be basically any, like, look any way that you want. I'm not sure if there's extra like functionality within this has many books that you could like point it to. Like I'm like envisioning like, oh, then you give it like a couple of optional arguments the same way that you could in like a regular model file. I'm just not sure if that's possible. And I think where I would go to figure that out is the fast JSON API, like documentation.
Then, so I could, so not necessarily within the relationships maybe, but I could create like a books method that calls those books, and could I like use the book serializer and call that inside of this store serializer?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying about customization. Like you can create the methods that you need to look, or to get the data formatted in the way that you want, with all of the, all of the attributes and classes that you have available. Like you could just basically say like you could not use the has many books, right? And then you could just like grab the books that you need manually by saying like, okay, book.all, and then I'm going to format it like this with the serializer, and then you could add books as like an attribute, and then that calls into your books method that you've created custom.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, good question there.
I did the whatever it's called. Not the Congress tracker one.
Okay, cool.
And so I'm on this and I added my relationships in my store serializer.
Yep.
And how do I get attributes to show up? Or I guess my question is, do attributes show up for relationships or like in relationships?
So by default, no. And this is like Andrew and I were actually kind of going back and forth on this. And so by default, no. When you use that has many helper in your serializer, it assumes, it makes some assumptions. It says, hey, I guess that you want to show these books, but we're only going to show you the ID and the type based on this JSON specification. That's all we want to show you. If you decide, hey, I actually want to show all my books with all of their attributes, what you can do here is instead of using has many books here, if you delete that, and then you put it in the attributes here, comma books. So now what this does now is it points to your has many books helper that lives on the model, right? Because and just creates that as an attribute of this specific store object. So now it's saying like, hey, like, yeah, one of my attributes that I'm going to show for every book is all of its books with all of those book details.
Is there ever going to be an instance where like you need the relationship to show and you also need it to show like attributes for the book?
I don't think so, because like there's no, you're not missing anything based on whether you do it this way or you do it the other way. It's kind of like if you have the reason that it only shows the ID and type is to like keep things simple, because it assumes that if you want to go and get all that book data and all those book attributes for those books, then you'll just grab those IDs and hit another endpoint that's typically available for books and you can do that like a find all by ID like kind of deal.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Absolutely. Cool. So we kind of got it kicked off the way that I was hoping. So appreciate you, Angel. Yeah, I think I just kind of want to see like what y'all came up with, if there are other questions that came up as you're customizing. If someone maybe did since we just looked at the store books example and someone did the users, I'd love to see that one. But this is more of like I want to hear from a few of you, see a few of you share, and then we'll go back to work. Cool. What's up, Doug?
I have a semi-related question. Can you do like an errors serializer, or will a serializer always return like a data type instead of a error type?
You can have an error serializer. If you use the fast JSON API, it will like use some code under the hood to format it according to the JSON API 1.0, and that is not to say that you can't use your own custom errors serializer as well. And you might even be able to point the fast JSON API like within, say, your member serializer. You might be able to point it to like a different error serializer. Like, hey, if there are errors like at the top level, if that's what you're about to return, go use this error serializer instead. I'm like thinking out loud. I think that that's probably possible. And then the other thing to think about is like generally the fast JSON API in theory should take care of those errors for you. Like it's doing a lot of that under the hood and serialize whatever it is. And if you don't want that, then what I would say is like you would want to I don't want to say that because I'm not. This is a long-winded. I'm not sure, but I know that the Fast JSON API has built-in functionality that will serialize it according to that JSON API 1.0. If you don't like that, you are welcome to be like, hey, I actually want to use a different error serializer when errors do occur. And so you could basically catch those before you call the member serializer, like within your service, right? You could be like, oh, like, or within your facade, like, oh, I got an error back. I'm actually going to use the errors serializer here instead of the member serializer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Would you still create like an errors object, or can you pass it in just like an errors hash or something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. You could probably pass it in. How do we usually do this? You can. Well, generally the errors are only going to be one, right? So you're only generally going to have one error. Like you're not going to get a 401 and a 404, right? So based on that, you can build your error serializer to read maybe the like dot error. You could have it kind of work a couple of ways. You could have it read the dot errors object that is created on a model, if that was something you could use. In this specific case, you might need to create an error poro or open struct, just because the way that we're getting the response back from the ProPublica API, it's going to be in JSON. And to be honest, I don't know if like the error serializer knows how to handle that. I know it knows how to handle objects, right? So I would stick with objects, and I might do exactly what you're saying, like here, like create an error object, pass it to the error serializer, just for consistency in this specific use case. But know that that's not always going to be necessary. It's necessary here because we're like getting a JSON response from an API. But if you're building it out just based on models, right, that exist in your database, then you can circumvent that and you don't actually have to go through that process. Cool. Yeah, good question there. Alex, go ahead.
I was trying to use the Congress thing and get like a count. We pass in like a bunch of users, get a count, and I couldn't get that working. So there's like kind of two questions. One, how do you get that working? And two, like we pass that in, like do we pass that in as meta information, like meta record count is X, or like you just add a count top level, or
generally that would be generally that would be, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Generally that would be like an attribute that you define, and you would say like, hey, like this is my custom attribute for this serializer. Let's go and, count all the, members or all of the users that are currently, all of the users based on the array that was passed to the serializer, right? So let's look at your code and see like what's going on, see if we can get it to work.
Okay. I assume you see code, or let me know.
Yeah, I see it. Okay, so attribute count. Cool.
There's another high level question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Which is like, how do you pass? I mean, are these instance variables like passed as like filtered down into the serializer like a view, or like how would I even access? Like I'm passing an array of users. Like this is what's breaking. It doesn't know what that is. I mean, it knows what it like gets an individual user. Like if you pry in here, I think we'll see it like run several times, I think.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna suggest, is like, let's look at it, see what's passed, see what the pry comes up with. So let's just see what self is. Okay. What we need to try a self.object. Let me look and see the syntax. Try just object. Hey, where is it? Okay. Okay, so give your block or give attribute a block. In the serializer, attribute count do, yeah, then give it the block object. And now I think we'll be able to grab whatever specific object we're on. But I don't know if that's actually what we want, so we'll have to see.
Oh, okay, yeah.
All right, let's see what object is. Okay, cool. So that's a singular user. So that's not that helpful because we can't get the count of the current, like, we can't get all of the objects, but I'm imagining that
Yeah.
there is a way to do that. I'm just not.
Can you try
So
calling
there's
object.users?
so there's like basically like this serializer is getting this like kind of phantom data or whatever. It's getting a user nonetheless. I'm passing it an array of users.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't verified that assumption, but I think I am. Passing an array of users, it's coming and hitting the serializer for each user, and it just has this kind of mystery object that you can't access until you use like a block, or it's implicitly like getting that whenever it's like attributes, ID, email, password. But like without the block, like that didn't exist. Or maybe there's another name for it or something like that. But line 8. So like anyway, I'm trying to just figure out like how the data is passed around, I guess. But anyway, that still doesn't like if we wanted to say the serializer returning an array, like we want to give them the content length or something, you know, we're giving you 4. So we're still there.
Yeah. I mean, we could like hack around it, right? And like look at, no, I don't want to do that. I was thinking like at the controller level, we could like set member serializer dot new, and then set that to a variable and then like dig into the JSON and like count how many data attributes are there, but that's kind of like going in circles. So let's look at the fast JSON API and see if there's a way to like count or like just get access, really, because we're not trying to count. We want to get access to the array that is passed in.
I'm assuming this is like the doc.
Yeah, the links are down at the bottom of the lesson plan.
Oh, I don't know if this is what that was. I just Googled fast JSON and it came up with this.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, it's the same thing. I think Netflix fast JSON. Yeah, same thing. So I mean, like, yeah, serialization definition, model definition. I didn't find anything in here in my earlier look that was like seemed to like address this. I mean, it addressed like meta somewhere.
Here we go.
There's like a meta tag, but
if you go down to the control over collection serialization, it's towards the bottom, but I would just Command F collection. You can use is collection option to have better control over collection serialization. So I'm thinking that with that, there's got to be a way we'll try to auto text single versus collection. I think that like Okay, so it looks like you'd have to pass it as an option when you pass it to the serializer. And so you'll do like options is collection is true, and then you would pass options there. But then I'm not it doesn't really give you like a great, doesn't tell you like, oh, now you can access.
By doing
Okay.
it this way, though, wouldn't all the users have that attribute? I was thinking that you would want like another section like outside with data, like like a user count outside of the actual users themselves.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. That makes more sense to me in terms of structure, just because like attribute is going to get called. Yeah, the way that attribute is going to get called is it's going to get called on every single user. So it would make more sense to be at the level that you're talking about, Joseph, just in terms of like how you're returning that data, right? It would be like, hey, here they all are, or here's how many there are at the top level, and then maybe like here are the users, each of them, you know, and all of their attributes. So what I'm
Yeah.
thinking
I mean,
then, yeah, we're not doing it. Yeah, exactly. Like we're not
I
doing
thought you
it
could
the
do
right
something
way.
like this. Like you can add like a meta tag or
Yep.
something based on this, like something like this, meta do whatever, and like do some code. So like that would at least, I would put it at like at the data level, that first top level, there'd be a meta.
Yep.
And you could pass it like count, but it still is like, how do we get this count? Like there has to be a way, and like I'm just trying to follow the like
Maybe you
lesson
pass
plan
it.
to figure out.
What I'm seeing is maybe, so this options meta total too, I'm thinking like maybe like what we do here is we pass it this like specific option when we call the serializer. So we could do like whatever our array is dot count, and then set that as an option when we pass options to the serializer, and then have that be like, okay, like now that's part of our options, like now we can like present that data in a specific way, because like the options are just a hash that like we can set that, like we can set whatever option we need in there, and basically options is just a way for you to like pass some data that's not those objects into the serializer and then access them. So it goes back to your original question of like, oh, how do I like access this you know, information? I think that the options hash is going to be our best way to like pass things down into it.
So something like this, declare an options hash, give it, I mean, I don't really know what to put here. Meta
I think I would put
equals,
options user count, so that like it's just like defining like, hey, this is our, this is our user count, and we'll just call that when we need it.
like that.
Yeah, let's give that a shot, and then let's just see where like in that, if it's in that block that we need to hit it,
Yeah,
or
whatever.
maybe it's outside of the block, but we can see.
Now we're here, not here. Hold on, that's not right.
So I just did the meta, and inside of that block, I did a user.all.length, and that seemed to work, but the meta lives outside. So there's 5 metas that show up for each user. Underneath each user, it's just outside of the hash.
Interesting. Okay, so that sounds like one way, and then I think that this options way is probably, I don't know which way is faster, honestly. I would think that the options way is faster because you just call an array method and then pass. Okay, so we don't have access to
And
it
the
there.
question is like what do we have? What did I call it? User count? Like, do we just have access to? I mean, like neither of those two things are there. We're in user. What did you do, Joseph? Like user dot. all.count or something?
I just did user.all.length inside of the meta block. So where your pry is.
Oh,
Interesting. That didn't work
Yeah.
for us.
yeah. So,
That
I
didn't
mean, at
work
this
for you.
point,
Like when you called on the class user.all.
yeah, and that block variable, it could be like what we're passing to the controller.
Well, I mean like capital U ser.all.
Oh, you just like called it. Oh,
Oh, you still have access to your user class there. I see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
okay. So it just says, because I guess Rails or whatever, you have access to like the user model. I don't know what other models we have, but
I wonder if you can access options like at that top level, like at the scope of the serializer class.
I'm not sure. So I guess like we're just kind of like trudging along here. I don't know if this has time appropriate for the rest of class, so I can like take my question off the air if I need to.
I think this was a good thing to look into, though, like just to show you, like, I mean, we're kind of toying around with the docs, the syntax, and what we need at any point. Like, this is a nice way to get like all the user count. The problem with the way that Joseph's doing it and the way that we're doing it to get this is we don't know if we like actually want all of the users counted, and that's going to match up with this array of users that we're passing the serializer, right? Because if we're passing the serializer a collection that's like a subset based on some query, then it's like, okay, well, I mean, I don't want this count. Like I don't want this count. I want the count of the actual collection I'm passing in. So my thought, so my thought is like that this is available, and we haven't figured out how yet, but we can.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's like.
So hold on, guys, hold on. So I'm gonna say like class for the sake of time, and y'all have other stuff to do. This is it for class. We spent the majority, like more time than I expected here, but I'm glad we did because we kind of like dug in. If you have other questions, I think like you can post them in that serializers thread, or you can stay on the call for a little bit longer and I'll answer some questions. And that's it. If you can take the class survey, I would super appreciate it. It's the same link forever. It's just which drop down class you pick. So the link, I'll drop it in a little bit, but it's also like just like back up a little bit in your channel. Yeah, I would appreciate that. And I'll see y'all at check-ins if you're with me. Thanks for your engagement.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks.
That's funny to watch on the what's it called? The closed captioning, the transcript. Anyways, okay. So Joseph, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how this would work necessarily, just because I'm thinking of it in terms of like maybe building a serializer where you can access all the users and then the user serializer inherits from that. But I don't know how that would actually work. I guess I found something that was talking about having an actual, let me see, sorry, like an active model serializer.
Yeah, so that's like a way that you can implement it, that you can implement serializers using Rails's built-in specification that basically you have to do a little bit more to customize it to this like JSON API 1.0, and that's what the fast JSON spec like just kind of like does a ton of that stuff for you under the hood, where if you use the built-in active model serializer, you have to do a little bit more work. But like that's the whole thing, is like you don't have to use this gem. Like you could use active model, like, or you could use the gem and like go with their specification. But like the whole thing is all we're doing is customizing the format of the JSON, right? And so we have, what I want y'all to hear is like we have complete control over that. There are a multitude of approaches to to get to what we want in the data.
Mhm.
Or I should say, to get the data to be structured the way that we want.
Hmm.
Hey, Tim, I had a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I was just curious, it's kind of off topic, but I was wondering what your thoughts are on XML versus JSON serializing. Kind of like, is JSON the standard for Rails because it's built in?
No, I would say that JSON is the standard across the web at this point, and XML was like before JSON became the standard. There was like JSON and XML, and now just about everyone has moved to JSON. Like XML is like gonna be legacy, slightly outdated.
Gotcha.
Does that like make sense? Like we don't even like, I've seen XML. I've had to deal with it a couple of times, like in my first job, but it's like, it's part of like legacy systems generally. And now if we're building newer systems, like the standard is JSON.
Cool. Thank you.
Of course. Let's see if something works real quick. Ah, perfect. Got one of those little camera covers, and it's nice. Or webcam sliders. All right, so I'm trying to play around with this and see if I can get that options hash to show up. Cool. Dang it. Where is that available? Self.options? Self options. I'm not seeing like how we access that options hash, but I mean, if we're passing it, then I would think that it has to be available somewhere. I think no, not yet. Not sure yet. Okay, so options is a hash that expects specific keys to be defined. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. The keys that you see in the documentation define like, hey, this is what you can assign as an option when you pass it in. And those are some specific keys. However, there's an options params value that allows you to pass in like a hash of additional parameters that you get to customize. So you would do something like, let's share. I was trying to pass it. Oh, that also, well, where was that at? I lost my options hash. I literally just defined it somewhere and okay, whatever. All right, so, oh yeah, I just did this. That's right. All right, so let's do, something like this, I think. Then we can access this somewhere. All right, so then I was looking here, and it looks like I need to do that in a block, but I can do that in any block. Okay, leveraging the new parentheses, define a custom attribute or relationship with a block. You opt into using params by adding it as a block parameter. Cool. All right, so then let's go to the serializer attribute. What do we call this thing? Whatever I want. Where is my, must have redefined it. Okay, so I'm in here. Hey, there we go. Okay, so that's how we pass in something custom, it looks like, and then we can kind of like use that on the fly however we need. So at this point, yeah, what I would do is I'd probably pass it in as a param so that I have it available. If I want it available for every single one, I would define it as an attribute. But like to Joseph's point, that might be something that I want to customize at the data level, just so it's not repeated for each object, right? Like just so we're not repeating ourselves. So now that's another thing that we'd have to go figure out. Like, okay, like how do we, put this at the top level?
Or maybe add it as another hash within. So it's like you have an array of hashes of all the users, and then before that, there's another hash that just has this key value pair.
Well, we still,
inside of it. Because looking at the docs, it looks like you're not really supposed to put anything else outside other than like maybe a metadata or the links.
That's what I was going to say is like we only want at the top level, it's like data, meta, or links, right? Or then errors is if the data is not there, or if we actually do have an error. So
how could you add this into the JSON just as another like?
I would put it as meta, I think.
Like, you would do it as meta?
I think like that's where I'm leaning towards because it's already top level. It follows the spec and it just like gives you some like extra data about your current data collection that you're returning.
Well, do you mind if I show you what that looks like on here? The way, at least the way that I did it.
Yep, let me just stop sharing real quick. And hold on, before we do that, actually, Hope, you've had a question. So what's your question?
Oh, sorry. here, I'll stop sharing.
Oh, I for some reason it can't find the serializer, and that's strange to me because I use the generator built into Rails.
And so what's the error you're getting? Just like uninitialized constant, whatever the serializer
Yeah.
is. All right. Yeah, let's look at the user's controller, wherever this error is happening. Line 3, the index. Oh, I think you're just missing a parentheses, and then you have a comma there. Oh no, I see what you're doing. Okay, never mind.
Yeah.
I don't, maybe, oh, it's because you're calling it users serializer, and I think it's called user serial. Oh, well, it says users serializer there, but maybe that's actually under the hood causing an issue, because I know that like you're supposed to define it singularly when you generate it.
It did originally come that way, but it didn't work that way either.
Oh, it didn't. Okay, well, was this happening before you were passing this options hash? Let's restart your server, because your server also like needs to be restarted if you make changes to file names. So that might be it.
Oh.
Yeah, cool.
Uh-oh.
Cool. Yeah, so options isn't defined there. You have to define it as like a hash outside of that block, but I think we're past. Yeah, I think we'll probably get a good on this now. Yeah, user count is not defined for the user. So that means that within your serializer now, this attribute user count, it doesn't know how to deconstruct, because it tried to call that on the user object and that wasn't there, but we're on our way.
Okay, well, at least I can find it now.
Yeah, that's like a Rails server thing. Whenever you make changes to file names, you got to restart it. Otherwise, it's not going to pick those up.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Joseph.
Yes. So it's showing up underneath every single one. What I was thinking is like what you have just being another hash within this array. So it's just one hash that lives above all of these other hashes of.
That's how I was thinking too. But let's look at your serializer and see like why it's doing that.
Which, and I understand that we should change this at this point, but.
Well, it sounds like it seems like the meta keyword then works for, or is going to show up on every collection, same way attribute does, just like as its own like meta tag. Which leads me to believe that there isn't really a way that
What if we didn't, is there a way to do the meta tag without it being a loop though? Because it's doing it for every user. If we were able to just call meta and then, you know, whatever we needed to get what we wanted.
You can give it a try at that level.
I don't know. I don't know what the syntax would be at all.
It might be that. It might be the way you had it. I don't know either. Okay, let's try that now. Yeah, unexpected colon. So let's just wrong number of arguments.
So
it doesn't expect any. No, that's saying you one and it doesn't want any. So
yeah,
I'm not sure.
Okay, I guess I just have to read the docs for that.
Yeah, and there might not be like there might be a reason that they're just like, actually we don't put that there, right? Like we just don't put like that information unless if you want to put that information, you have to add it to every single piece of data, even though that's redundant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I was looking at the doc and it says there's a meta key to the options hash. So you may be able to do options meta and pass it a hash for what you want to be in that.
That makes sense to me. Options meta. At that point, I would think that you also just like pass it probably just a value, like whatever that count value is, and maybe it shows up at the top level. I mean, we can like play around and
Yeah,
see.
I guess if you did that, you wouldn't have to access that in the serializer because presumably it's making that meta hash with whatever you pass it, key value pairs you pass the meta hash.
Yeah, exactly.
Or the meta key.
So
Yeah, okay.
Let's try that. I'll just add it to my options hash and see if it works. Options meta 10. Minor pry. Yeah.
You'll have to give it a key value pair like I don't, you may have done that, but as you're reading. Yeah, like options meta takes a hash.
Okay, so. Yeah, that worked. I'll show you the structure real quick. So I set the meta parameter here with like, I just hard coded this value, but like essentially this could be like members.count, right? Like here, and I can even change it so we can see. And then I put this value, but this could be whatever we want it to be. And then it shows up outside of, but like below the data tag on this top level. Now, if I go back and search, it should be hopefully 2. Yeah. So I like that. I think that's where that's where it belongs to me, right? It's like one time outside of the data, little information about the data, right? All right, I think that's it then. Appreciate y'all
Thanks
sticking
for
around.
diving so deep in that.
Oh yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, for sure.
It's fun. Appreciate y'all's questions and kind of tinkering. Yeah, I'm gonna close it out.
Cool. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, thank you all.